More than 70 Russian military vehicles were reported destroyed or disabled in just a few hours, turning what was meant to be a fast armored thrust into one of the most costly setbacks Moscow has faced along the Donetsk-Luhansk line in recent months. What unfolded on this stretch of the front was not a random clash or a lucky strike. Instead, that column entered a battle space already mapped, tracked, and prepared. As the convoy advanced, Ukrainian systems were already watching from above and listening from afar, combining drone feeds, thermal signatures, and signal activity to read the formation before the first shot was fired. By the time Russian units realized they were under attack, the fight was already tilted against them, with key vehicles struck, routes blocked, and command links under pressure. This was not just about tanks burning or vehicles abandoned on the road. It was a clear signal of how modern warfare now punishes visibility, predictability, and slow adaptation. Heavy armor no longer moves unseen. Large columns no longer buy safety. And once control is lost in the opening minutes, recovery becomes nearly impossible. The critical question raised by this ambush is not how many vehicles were hit. It is why a force of this size could be neutralized so quickly, and what that says about the changing balance between technology, information, and raw firepower on today's battlefield. Early detection reshaped the entire fight because the Russian column was identified long before it reached a point where speed or armor could protect it. Ukraine did not react to contact, since the movement was already visible through layered surveillance that tracked direction, spacing, and tempo, while the convoy was still advancing toward the Donetsk-Luhansk line. The first change came from persistent UAV coverage, which stayed above the routes instead of chasing targets only after contact. Reconnaissance drones followed the column across open ground and tree lines, allowing operators to observe how vehicles were grouped and how gaps formed between heavy armor and lighter elements as the convoy moved forward. This view made it possible to see that the formation was mixed, with tanks and armored carriers leading while support vehicles and mobile infantry followed in a looser pattern. Thermal monitoring added another layer to that picture because engine heat exposed movement even when visual cues were limited by terrain or smoke. Heat signatures revealed when vehicles slowed, clustered, or changed direction, which showed stress points in the formation that could later be exploited. Once engines heated unevenly across the column, it became clear where command vehicles paused and where recovery assets stayed close, signaling which targets mattered most. Signals monitoring reinforced these observations by highlighting a rise in communication activity as the convoy approached contested ground. Increased traffic suggested coordination between units rather than routine movement, which confirmed that this was not a simple transfer but a planned push. That information reduced uncertainty and allowed Ukrainian commanders to treat the advance as a deliberate assault rather than a probe. The key advantage of this early detection was not speed, but clarity. Ukraine could see how the convoy would likely fight before the fighting began, which made it possible to shape the engagement instead of reacting to it. By reading the structure of the column, planners could anticipate where disruption would cause the greatest confusion once the ambush started. This preparation removed surprise from the Russian side and replaced it with exposure. When the column continued forward, it did so under constant observation, which meant every kilometer increased risk rather than reducing it. Unlike traditional engagements where large artillery strikes announce intent, this phase stayed quiet. No massed fire signaled danger, and no visible movement suggested a trap. That silence was part of the method, because the decisive action depended on holding fire until the formation reached the most vulnerable point. By the time the convoy entered that zone, Ukraine already understood its layout and rhythm. This approach marked a shift away from relying on volume of fire alone. Instead of trying to overwhelm through scale, Ukraine focused on seeing first and choosing when and where to strike. In modern combat, That sequence matters more than raw numbers, because control of information sets the terms of contact. The result of this detection phase was simple but decisive. Russia advanced into a fight it did not know was already defined, while Ukraine entered with a plan built on observation rather than reaction. Once contact began, the outcome was shaped by everything that had already been seen and understood before the first explosion. The ambush took shape through a two-axis layout, because Ukraine aimed to break the Russian formation as a system rather than destroy vehicles one by one. Instead of focusing on a single strike point, Ukrainian planners divided the battlefield into a forward block and a rear pressure zone, which allowed control over both movement and reaction once contact began. The first axis was positioned to confront the heavy armor leading the advance. Tanks and armored carriers at the front were expected to open space and set the pace, so this line became the key to slowing everything behind it. When fire was applied to these lead vehicles, the goal was not only destruction but delay, since a stopped tank on a narrow route turns into a physical barrier that reshapes traffic and timing. As the front slowed, following units were forced closer together, which reduced flexibility and increased exposure. At the same time, the second axis focused on the mobile layer moving behind the armor. Light vehicles and infantry elements relied on speed and gaps created by the lead tanks, so pressure on this group aimed to remove that advantage. Once fire landed among these units, movement routes narrowed and coordination weakened, because drivers and dismounted troops had to react without clear direction from the front. This created confusion that could not be solved by pushing forward or pulling back. What made this layout effective was timing rather than volume. The two axes did not operate in isolation, since actions on the front immediately shaped conditions in the rear. When a lead vehicle halted or burned, space disappeared for the column behind it, and when the rear came under pressure, the front lost support and awareness. Each axis reinforced the other, turning the formation into a compressed mass instead of a flowing advance. This approach denied Russia the option to reorganize under fire. A force can recover from losses if it can pause, regroup, and restore links between units, but that requires space and time. The two-axis design removed both, because any attempt to adjust in one direction increased risk in the other. Vehicles that tried to bypass the blockage faced fire from the rear pressure zone, while those that stayed put remained exposed to strikes from the forward block. Control of terrain played a quiet but critical role in this phase. Ukraine selected positions that limited detours and forced vehicles to remain within predictable paths. As the convoy entered these areas, movement choices narrowed, and every decision carried visible consequences. This environment favored the ambush, since predictability made targeting faster and responses slower. The result was a rapid loss of tactical cohesion. Russian units could still move and fire in isolated moments, but they could no longer act as a single force. Command signals struggled to translate into action once vehicles were separated by damage, smoke, and blocked routes. Without a clear picture of what was happening across the column, coordination broke down at the moment it was most needed. This breakdown explains why the engagement escalated so quickly. When formations lose internal links, pressure multiplies rather than spreads out. Every hit creates new obstacles, and each obstacle feeds the next disruption. The two-axis ambush exploited this dynamic by striking where recovery depended on cooperation. In the end, the formation was not defeated by a single blow. The collapse of the forward line decided the battle within minutes, because once the lead vehicles were neutralized, the rest of the column lost direction and purpose. Russian T-72 tanks, BTR carriers, and MTLB vehicles at the front were hit early, which stopped momentum and removed the protective screen that the rest of the force depended on to move safely. The first effects were physical and immediate. When a tank at the head of a column was disabled, the road space behind it vanished, and vehicles following had no clear path forward or backward. Smoke, debris, and burning fuel narrowed visibility, which forced crews to slow down and cluster closer together. That compression turned an organized advance into a static target area within a very short window. Loss of the forward line also disrupted awareness. Lead elements normally absorb contact and pass information back, but once those vehicles were knocked out, the flow of updates stopped. Crews behind them could not see what had been hit or where fire was coming from, and radio messages became fragmented under pressure. This uncertainty spread faster than any physical damage because hesitation replaced movement at the moment speed mattered most. Precision fire deepened that effect by striking nodes rather than chasing every vehicle. Artillery and drones focused on command vehicles and control points, which stripped the formation of coordination instead of simply reducing numbers. When a commander vehicle went silent or a relay point was destroyed, units behind it were left acting on guesswork. Orders that arrived late or not at all caused vehicles to react on instinct rather than plan. This is where the forward collapse became irreversible. A unit can continue to fight with losses, but it cannot continue to advance without control. As the front disintegrated, each vehicle behind faced a choice with no good outcome, because pushing forward risked entering blocked lanes while stopping invited follow-up strikes. Neither option restored coherence. Drones added pressure by maintaining constant contact on exposed positions. Once lead armor stopped, overhead systems marked targets and passed data to firing units in real time. That feedback loop shortened response times and removed the need for correction fire. Hits landed where movement slowed or vehicles clustered, which reinforced the breakdown already underway. The destruction of the forward screen also exposed support vehicles that were never meant to take direct fire. Recovery assets and ammunition carriers moved closer as the column slowed, which placed them within reach of precision strikes. When these vehicles were disabled, the chance of restoring mobility dropped sharply, because damaged armor could no longer be pulled out or resupplied. At this stage, the formation was no longer a single force. It became a series of isolated pockets reacting independently under stress. Some crews attempted to maneuver around obstacles, while others stayed in place hoping for orders or cover. That fragmentation prevented any coordinated response, even though individual vehicles were still capable of firing. The speed of this collapse is what stands out. From first contact to full loss of the forward line, only a brief period passed, and that short span decided the engagement. Once control nodes were hit and lead armor removed, the rest of the battle followed a predictable pattern of disruption rather than resistance. This phase shows why modern engagements hinge on disabling structure instead of chasing destruction alone. By breaking the forward line and targeting command links, Ukraine removed the ability to fight as a unit. The collapse of the rear elements turned the battle from disruption into breakdown, because once pressure shifted behind the front line, the entire column lost any chance to recover. As the leading armor stalled, Ukrainian firepower did not pause, since attention moved quickly to the vehicles that carried mobility, supplies, and follow-on firepower. Pickups, motorcycles, and small mobile teams suddenly became exposed targets. These vehicles depended on speed and spacing to survive, but the slowed advance removed both advantages at the same time. When routes narrowed and traffic compressed, light vehicles clustered in places they were never meant to stay, which made them visible and vulnerable from above. FPV drones became the main tool in this phase because they could strike quickly without warning and choose targets that mattered most. Operators directed drones toward vehicles carrying ammunition, crew weapons, and air defense gear, which increased damage beyond the initial impact. When one vehicle detonated, the blast often affected others nearby, spreading shock and confusion through the group in seconds. This created a strong psychological effect that spread faster than physical destruction. Drivers who saw explosions ahead or beside them hesitated, braked, or swerved, which caused collisions and blocked narrow paths. Once panic set in, movement stopped being controlled and started becoming instinctive, which further exposed crews to follow-up attacks. Precision artillery reinforced this chaos by sealing escape routes rather than chasing targets. Instead of firing across the entire area, guns focused on key ground where vehicles might turn, regroup, or retreat. Each strike removed options, which forced units to remain inside zones already under drone observation. The combination of drones above and artillery on the ground created a closed space. Vehicles that tried to flee encountered blocked paths or incoming fire, while those that stopped remained marked from the air. There was no safe pause point where commanders could restore order or redirect movement. Support roles suffered heavily during this stage. Vehicles carrying ammunition or recovery equipment moved forward as the column slowed, believing their presence might restore momentum. When these assets were hit, any chance of pulling damaged vehicles out or resupplying front units disappeared. That loss turned temporary damage into permanent losses within minutes. The rapid tempo of these strikes mattered more than sheer numbers. FPV drones arrived in waves that kept pressure constant, which prevented crews from adapting or learning from earlier hits. Every attempt to adjust movement drew another response, and each response increased disorder instead of reducing it. Coordination on the Russian side weakened further as units became isolated. Some groups dismounted and attempted to take cover, while others remained inside vehicles hoping to move when space opened. Precision fire also removed the illusion of distance from danger. Even vehicles that were not directly engaged felt exposed, because strikes landed behind the main contact line. This erased the idea of a safe rear area and turned the entire formation into a contested zone. By the time smoke covered the rear positions, the battle had shifted fully in Ukraine's favor. What began as an armored advance had become a sequence of isolated survival attempts. Movement no longer served the mission, and firepower no longer supported cohesion. Once drones and precision artillery work together, light mobility becomes a weakness instead of a shield. The rear collapse did not happen by chance because it followed a clear logic that targeted support, morale, and options at the same time. The chain reaction completed the ambush. With the front blocked and the rear shattered, the column ceased to function as a force. From that point forward, the outcome was decided by control rather than continued fighting. The outcome of the engagement became clear shortly after the initial exchanges, because the attacking force could no longer function as a coordinated unit. Video analysis from the battlefield showed that most Russian vehicles were either destroyed or left unable to move soon after contact began, which meant the advance stopped before it could reach any operational goal. Once the column broke apart, the damage spread unevenly but decisively. Vehicles that survived the first strikes often sat abandoned or immobilized, surrounded by wreckage that blocked movement and limited visibility. Crews who attempted to reposition found routes cut by debris and fire, while those who stayed in place faced continued pressure from above. This pattern turned isolated losses into a broad collapse that no local decision could reverse. The absence of recovery assets mattered at this stage. With support vehicles disabled earlier in the fight, damaged armor could not be pulled away or repaired under fire. A vehicle that might have been saved in another setting became a permanent loss once it was left in the open. This converted tactical damage into strategic cost within a short period. Control of the area shifted quickly as Russian movement slowed to a halt. Ukrainian units were able to secure ground around the engagement zone, not through a sweeping push, but by denying the opponent any chance to regroup. Smoke and scattered wrecks marked the battlefield, while the lack of hostile movement confirmed that the advance had ended. Losses on the Ukrainian side remained limited, which reinforced the imbalance created during the ambush. Most damage reported involved minor equipment issues rather than destroyed platforms, and personnel injuries were few compared to the scale of the engagement. This contrast highlighted how preparation and timing can reduce exposure even during intense contact. The halted advance carried immediate consequences beyond the wrecked vehicles. A stalled push disrupted plans across the sector, because follow-on actions depended on the success of this movement. When the column failed, momentum faded, and nearby units faced a pause instead of pressure. That pause gave defenders time to adjust positions and strengthen control. Footage of immobilized vehicles and abandoned equipment spread quickly, reinforcing the sense that large formations could no longer move with confidence under constant observation. Crews and commanders alike were forced to consider that exposure now begins well before contact. This engagement illustrated a wider shift in how power is applied on the battlefield. Mass still matters, but it no longer guarantees progress when surveillance and precision fire dominate. A large force that cannot hide its movement or protect its support elements becomes fragile once detected. When movement was blocked, command links disrupted, and recovery denied, the advance lost meaning even before every vehicle was hit. By the end of the fighting, the situation was settled without a prolonged chase. The attacking force had been stopped, the area was under control, and the immediate threat had passed. What remained were lessons written across the ground in burned metal and silence. This phase confirms a simple reality of modern combat. Numbers alone no longer decide outcomes when information and precision shape the fight. More than a single ambush, what happened along the Donetsk-Luhansk line sends a blunt warning about how modern war now works. Ukraine combined early detection, layered surveillance, precision fire, and a two-axis ambush to break the Russian advance at every level. The forward armor was blocked and neutralized, the rear elements were shattered under drone pressure, and command links failed before recovery was possible. What followed was not a long battle but a rapid collapse driven by loss of control rather than lack of equipment. Even without fully verified damage figures from independent bodies, battlefield footage and open analysis point to heavy Russian losses and limited Ukrainian damage. More important than the numbers is the pattern, because once movement was exposed and options disappeared, the outcome became predictable. This raises a larger question that goes beyond one sector of the front. Can large armored columns still operate in an environment where drones watch every route and precision weapons strike without warning? Or will future offensives require smaller units, tighter coordination, and stronger protection against surveillance from above? The answers are not clear yet, and that uncertainty is exactly what makes this moment important. Adaptation will decide who keeps the initiative and who pays the price for moving the old way. Share thoughts in the comments. Like the video, share it with others who follow modern warfare, and subscribe to Military Force for more clear reporting on real battles, modern weapons, and the politics shaping today's conflicts.